Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. And this afternoon, we'll be talking about a new book by Samuel Freedman entitled Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights, published by Oxford University Press this past July. Today, we're joined with a panel consisting of Jane Daly of the University of Chicago and Elizabeth Shermer of Loyola University. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University. I co-chair the seminar with Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He's traveling internationally and won't be joining us this afternoon. The seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association, a program that's been exploring new historical scholarship since 2010. A few quick FYIs before we get started. First, the next seminar will take place in 4 days, this coming Monday, October 16th at 4 p.m. You can join us for a session on Brooke Blower's Americans in a World at War, Intimate Histories from the Crash of Pan Am's Yankee Clipper, with commentators Mary Dudziak and Eric Rauschway. Second, as always, our thanks to two people who work very hard behind the scenes to make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the American Historical Association. Third, on the logistics front, please note today's session, as always, is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And finally, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with things to say to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. If you use the raise hand function, I get to call on you, you unmute, you get to pose the question. If you post it on the Q&A function on Zoom, I get to read your question, and you can get in the queue at any point during the webinar. We'll call on as many folks as we can. So with those preliminaries out of the way, we can get the seminar going. Samuel Freedman is the author of 10 books, including the newly released Into the Bright Sunshine, Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights. He's a professor of journalism at Columbia University and a former columnist for the New York Times. He's been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for his 1996 book, The Inheritance, How Three Families and America Moved from Roosevelt to Reagan, and for the National Book Award for 1990, his book, Small Victories, The Real World of a Teacher or Students and Their High School. Today, we're delighted he can join us to discuss his latest book, Into the Bright Sunshine. Sam, welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Thanks very much for having me, Eric. It's a real honor to be here. As someone who's not a formally trained historian, it's a dizzying experience to be among those who actually were trained in doing this work that I've only aspired to. So I'll begin, as you've asked me to, by talking about a couple of the arguments that my book does set out to make. And I think one is biographical and one is historical, and they both fall under the category of filling what I perceived to be gaps in the existing both scholarly and more journalistic literature. I think for people who remember Hubert Humphrey or think about him much these days at all, he's remembered for the latter part of his career in public life, which was a period when he was largely, and for very legitimate reasons, discredited. He was associated with support for the Vietnam War as Lyndon Johnson's vice president. He received a Democratic nomination for president in 1968 against the backdrop of the Chicago police riot against unarmed anti-war protesters and journalists, and received that also through the machinations of the Democratic Party machine. He ran as the establishment's candidate for the Democratic nomination in 1972 against George McGovern, who was the peace candidate. That was the race in which Hunter S. Thompson infamously described him as campaigning like a rat in heat. And I think that's the Humphrey who has come down over the years. And the gap that I saw was an earlier Humphrey coming into his public life in the 1940s, Humphrey as mayor of Minneapolis in the mid-1940s, and Humphrey in the crescendo of my book at the Democratic National Convention in 1948, being one of the most important civil rights advocates and activists in the country. And I'll talk more about the movement of the 40s in a moment. And I felt that that part of Humphrey's life was little known, little regarded, if known, and yet probably more important, more his lasting legacy than his unfortunate support of Vietnam was. And part of what I wanted to do in writing about Humphrey was answer a question, and a good fellow professor, friend of mine, Michael Shapiro, always says a book has to answer a question. And my question was, if I may use one of the locutions of that great philosopher, George Clinton of P-Funk, how does a vanilla guy from a vanilla place end up caring so much about fighting anti-Semitism and fighting racism? How does that happen? And that compelled me to look at what forms Humphrey. But I also, from the beginning, had three goals for this book. One was not to write a cradle-to-grave biography, because I think often those are too encyclopedic, and there's almost, I feel like sometimes an arms race in terms of who can make the encyclopedic book the most full. And I recognize that there are people like Bev Gage and, Ron Chernow, Robert Caro, who can write books like that and make them incredibly readable, but that wasn't a particular hill I wanted to climb. And also I felt that a lot of what was in print about Humphrey, Arnold Offner's book, Carl Solberg's book, obviously some of Caro's recent volumes on Johnson, was all about the later Humphrey. I didn't feel like I had things to add on that subject, or not enough to add. The second commitment I made is this wouldn't be a great man or woman in history book, that even though Humphrey I felt was tremendously important, I couldn't center him at the expense of other people, that this was a book that had to look at his allies and adversaries, the milieu around him. And finally, I set out not to write a white savior book, that the challenge for me was to write a book that would give Humphrey his due, but wouldn't present him as someone who's doing for Jews or who's doing for African Americans. And along those lines, it was tremendously important for me to see who the people were, both intimately in Humphrey's life and in the broader movement around him, the Blacks and Jews, and also women, I should add, who were vital to that cause and vital to instructing him in that cause. The second gap I wanted to fill was the historical gap. And just as what's known and written about with Humphrey tends to start in the mid-1960s, what's most written about and most widely known about the civil rights movement, notwithstanding a really terrific recent book like Matthew Delmont's Half American, starts in the 1950s. It's as if the movement begins with Thurgood Marshall winning Brown versus Board of Ed, the Supreme Court decision that declares school segregation unconstitutional, and then with Rosa Parks and Dr. King and the mass movement of the Montgomery bus boycott, and then proceeds through these, epic events that many of us know about, the lunch counter sit-ins, the freedom rides, the passage of major civil rights legislation during the Johnson administration in the mid-1960s, the Poor People's March, and so on. It takes nothing away from the valor and historical importance of those events to say that the civil rights movement of the 1940s has often been overlooked, and that what happens in the mid-1950s doesn't come ex nihilo, that it's impossible to conceive of that movement without the movement of the 1940s. And the movement of the 1940s is inextricably bound up with World War II. It's inextricably bound up with the campaign that Black GIs launch, which goes under the phrase double, or the motto double V, for double victory, victory over fascism abroad, and then victory over Jim Crow at home. And that was a movement that had its parallel in the feelings, although there wasn't a similar phrase, but in the attitudes of Jewish GIs who were going into war to battle against fascism, and most importantly in Germany, where their own people were at mortal risk and expected to come back home and win full equality for Jews in this country. And this was a movement in which the most important figures, of course, were Black Americans themselves, A. Philip Randolph, the labor and civil rights leader, Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP, Mary McLeod Bethune. But I would argue that in that period of time, the two most important Caucasians who were in it as partners, allies, whatever term you want to use, are Eleanor Roosevelt and Hubert Humphrey, that they are second to none in putting their white privilege at risk. They're second to none in putting, in Humphrey's case, his political career at risk in order to join in that battle. And so telling the story of the movement of the 40s and the role that World War II had in it was another goal of this book. And I think those two things converge. And the last thing I'll add, or two more things I want to add. One is when I started writing this book in 2015, knowing how big a role Minneapolis was going to play in it, part of me wondered who was going to care about the history of the battles against racism and anti-Semitism in Minneapolis. Who's going to care that Minneapolis was arguably the most anti-Semitic city in the country for the most of the first half of the 20th century until Humphrey becomes mayor in 1945, and that it was a virulently racist city for all that time as well. And in that tragic, ghoulish way that books sometimes maybe get more attention because of outer events, the murder of George Floyd, I think put more attention on my book than it otherwise would have had, because I think part of what I aim to do, particularly mindful of this after George Floyd's murder, was show the path to that, and show also the missed opportunity to really do meaningful police reform in Minneapolis during Hubert Humphrey's mayoralty, which on that matter ended too soon. His upward mobility was so rapid that his agenda of police reform, which was a significant one and had at that time broad public support, was abandoned and never achieved. The other point to make here, which again pivots on what happened after I started this book in January of 2015, is that having set out to write a book that would, as I said before, try to fill in a biographical gap and a historical gap, and that was plenty for me to be very excited about writing the book. But once November 2016 happens and we enter in a formalized way the Trump era, I became very aware that I was writing current events, or an analog to current events, and that the battle that people like Humphrey and A. Philip Randolph are part of in the 1940s is an earlier iteration, in my view, of the same battle we're fighting now. It's a battle of inclusive, interracial, interfaith democracy, small d, but also a Democratic Party that, coming out of 1948, increasingly is a coalition built along those lines. That battle against forms of autocracy and forms of demagoguery. And in the 1940s, in Humphrey's time as mayor and a rising national star, just like today, the terms that autocracy went by were white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and America Firstism. And so I realized I was also taking a look at an analogous period of time to the very perilous one we're in right now. And so those were the things I wanted to say to set the table. And of course, I'm very eager to hear from the respondents and carry on the discussion.
Sam, thank you. Our first discussant this afternoon is Jane Daly, a professor of history, the college, and the law school at the University of Chicago. She is the author of Before Jim Crow, The Politics of Race in Post-Emancipation Virginia, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2000. The Age of Jim Crow, a Norton documentary history, published by, Norton in 2008. Building the American Republic, the second volume, a narrative history from 1877, University of Chicago Press, 2018. And most recently, White Fright, The Sexual Panic at the Heart of America's Racist History, published by Basic Books in 2020. This is a work that concerns race, sex, and the civil rights movement from emancipation to the present. Jane, welcome to the seminar. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Eric. I'm really happy to be here, as it were. Sam, if I may, I really enjoyed reading this book. You pull the reader along really beautifully, while still giving us a glimpse, more than a glimpse, really, of farming and, as you say, stem rust, and other things. One, I would never have guessed that you were not from the Midwest.
I've spent time there, but I went to college in Madison, Wisconsin, and lived some in Minneapolis. So those are, blue cosmopolitan cities, so very different from the Dakotas for sure.
Indeed. Reading your book left me with all kinds of questions about Humphrey, about the intervening years between 1948 and 1964-ish that I probably should know the answers to, but don't. And I don't want to push the discussion too much in that direction. One of the many things I did not know about Hubert Humphrey was that he seconded Henry Wallace's renomination as vice president in 1944. He had been, as you say, Franklin Roosevelt's third vice president. He was considered too left for the Democratic Party, largely because of his views on race. I found it really interesting that it was Humphrey who seconded that. I wish that I knew more about Humphrey's interactions with Wallace, if as a young man, Humphrey had interactions with Wallace, because again, Henry Wallace is also one of these people who is underappreciated in American history for similar reasons. So I wondered if there was a connection there, if you could draw a connection between the young Hubert Humphrey and Henry Wallace, because Wallace just sort of gets wiped out of American history after he ceases to be, after he loses in 1948, after he's red-baited. But I bring that up in part because I want to poke you a little bit on your comment that Eleanor Roosevelt and Hubert Humphrey were the most influential sort of civil rights advocates, white civil rights advocates in the 20th century. So I would put Henry Wallace in there, and also I would he's not white, but I would put Benjamin Mays right up there, and he's another kind of forgotten person. Benjamin Mays, really the best known African-American educator, but also civil rights proponent in the 1940s and 50s, just constantly pounding people for not supporting civil rights, starting in the war, but going forward into the 50s. I like the way that you end in 1948, because a few years ago at the University of Chicago, there was a whole year-long seminar on 1948, because so many things happened in 1948, and it just keeps, it's quite a year in terms of representing a real, I think, historical narrative break in lots of different ways in American history. One of those ways is with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Again, the drafting committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, which brings a bunch of the vocabulary that Hubert Humphrey draws upon into common currency in American politics. So words like human rights, dignity. So that's one thing happening in the late 40s. And the other thing I wanted to connect to that, I pay attention to where these words pop up, in part because I ended up spending an awful lot of time thinking about Henry Wallace and Benjamin Mays while writing a book that was ostensibly about sexual politics of race. And that took me a lot into Christian theology and the way that people used the language and the arguments of Christian theology to make pro-civil rights arguments well before Dr. King made those sorts of arguments. People did in the 30s as well, but you had kind of two sides, the communists, and you had the liberal Christians arguing for human rights in the late 40s. So I'm not sure Hubert Humphrey rises to the level in my mind of Henry Wallace on the rights issue, but then maybe that's because he does so in the 1960s. One more point that I really wanted to make was how detailed and disturbing and fascinating your discussion of anti-Semitism in Minneapolis was. For me, that was the most revelatory part of the book. And I really salute you for connecting with such texture the fight against anti-Semitism and the fight against anti-Black racism in a seemingly unlikely place of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Being in Chicago, I could see someone making these kinds of arguments or going looking for these things. And Chicago was fascinating to me that Minneapolis has such characters, and you really made them live for me. People like Sam Shiner, who is just, when they send him off in the infantry, it was just like, you can't do that. He's 35 years old. So that was really interesting to me, that background. And again, if we're looking at what made Hubert Humphrey the person who could stand up in 1948 and risk his political career by arguing in almost apocalyptic terms about the importance of civil rights for America, you show us that the place he came from was really much more varied than anyone would think. He knew those people. He was involved with these people, some of whom, as you say, were women. And you can see, by reading your book, you can see how he is the guy who stands up in 1948. And, as you say, most American histories, I've done it myself, reduced Hubert Humphrey to 2 sentences. In 1948, they say Hubert Humphrey stood up and talked about human rights, and the White South walked out. And, on we go to the next, without ever asking the question, why was it Hubert Humphrey and not someone else? So I think that sometimes biography doesn't take us very far in terms of historical argumentation. But this biography, which I sort of felt was almost a collective biography of Minnesota and its role in the Midwest, I feel like takes us, you do answer questions. You ask the question at the beginning, the making of Hubert Humphrey, and you really show that and why that matters for one, nodal point in American history in 1948, for which Hubert Humphrey is remembered by historians, I think, especially at the present time with all of the interest in human rights, really much more. I think the pendulum has swung to remembering Hubert Humphrey from that moment rather than castigating him so much for his positions in the 60s. But that may just be because I've spent so much time looking at the war years. But I want to give everybody a chance to speak here, but just to say how you wouldn't think, it's a page turner, and I really appreciate that, because it's really hard to write a book like that and to keep your reader engaged and moving along when they know how the story ends in particular. So I just, hats off, really admire the way that you pull that off in this book.
Jane, thank you. Sam, any thoughts or responses you'd like to offer?
First of all, just thank you so much, Jane, to hear words like yours from a person of your deep, long-lasting scholarship means everything. And actually, I'll be at University of Chicago in November, so I hope we can meet and have coffee then.
That'd be great.
I agree with you about Henry Wallace. And I think I should probably, when I talk about the Caucasians who were important to the movement, add Wallace as an equal. And you're right, he was incredibly courageous in championing civil rights, in speaking in the South in defiance of segregation laws to integrated audiences about civil rights during his 1948 campaign. And there's no question the way he pushed the issue, I don't think Humphrey needed pushing on it personally, but it helped push the Democratic Party on it to know that they had Henry Wallace as a, third, or in this case, fourth, counting the Dixiecrats, party candidate. And one of Humphrey's, his most important Black friend and ally in Minneapolis, a newspaper publisher named Cecil Newman. Cecil Newman, during the 48 campaign, would run a weekly poll of the Black vote in Minnesota. And up until the point that Humphrey gives the civil rights speech and the Democratic Party endorses a civil rights plank, Henry Wallace is winning the outright majority of the Black vote in Minnesota. And Truman is some weeks second and some weeks third, but both of them very far behind Wallace. And of course, as you point out or hint at, Humphrey and Henry Wallace, who'd been very close as fellow New Dealers, as fellow liberals, as fellow activists on issues of racial equality, have an incredible rupture over the Cold War in 1946, 47, 48, and it blows apart what had been a political alliance and a friendship. And of course, that's part of the broader story of the CP and the Popular Front and the anti-communist liberals during that period when internationally the Cold War is beginning. With Benjamin Mays, having written about HBCUs in one of my previous books, I'm well acquainted and admiring of his work as a thought leader and a president of Morehouse. I guess the only reason I wouldn't have put him quite in the echelon with Walter White and A. Philip Randolph is that they were able to achieve concrete goals at the end, which is also part of my argument on behalf of Humphrey. So with Randolph, the reason there's a Wartime Fair Employment Practices Commission is because he assembles a nascent March on Washington in 1941 that's only called off after FDR capitulates on forming a Fair Employment Commission for the defense plants, basically. And Walter White's incredible, courage in going to the South, passing as white. If you ever see a photo of Walter White, maybe we can put one up for everyone. He's very fair-skinned. He's blue-eyed. Only in a country with the one-drop rule like America would he ever have been constructed as black in the first place. But he uses that to go undercover in the South and to do research into lynchings and other forms of extrajudicial killings and forms of white terrorism. And I think that the importance of his work in affecting public opinion and ultimately contributing to political change is the other reason I would have him up there, taking nothing away from Benjamin Mays. I think that, to address one of your other points, the importance of what Humphrey accomplishes in 48 is that when the Democrats endorse explicitly civil rights and say desegregate the military, pass an anti-lynching law, outlaw the poll tax, and also we're going to extend this guarantee to not only people who are subject to discrimination on the basis of race, but on the basis of religion and national origin. So this is a plank that's really important to Catholics, to Jews, to Mexican Americans, who are the primary Hispanic population at that time, and to Chinese Americans and Nisei Japanese. This is a concrete agenda. It forces Harry Truman, who'd gone back and forth on civil rights and was backing away at this time, to run as a civil rights candidate. Without that plank, and also without A. Philip Randolph's campaign of mass black draft resistance and refusal to serve if called up until Harry Truman desegregates the military, without both the inside game and the outside game, you wouldn't have Harry Truman 2 weeks after the Democratic Convention issuing executive orders to desegregate the military and desegregate the federal workforce. And he wins, Truman, because of a surge of black votes in swing states. The incomplete part of 48 is that the promise that's made lays there latent until John F. Kennedy is assassinated and Lyndon Johnson becomes president. Truman is too unpopular to manage it as a lame duck president. Adlai Stevenson and John F. Kennedy on the Democratic side and Dwight Eisenhower on the Republican side are timid and reluctant to really commit political capital, except in a case like Little Rock, where finally you have to do something. So the promises of 48 aren't really acted upon till 64, 65, and 66, but they are ultimately acted upon. In terms of Christian theology as a factor, I am so glad you said that, because it's one of the underappreciated parts, not only of the movement prior to King, but also of Humphrey in particular. Humphrey is formed by the social gospel. Humphrey is formed in many ways by the struggle in the Protestant sphere between two forms of fundamentalism. One form of fundamentalism is oriented around personal purity and issues like temperance and teaching evolution, and has this is William Jennings Bryan's form of populism. And even when it's economically progressive, it's tainted, it's discredited by its tolerance for or even advocacy of racism and nativism and eugenics and so on. And on the other side of that, the social gospel Protestants actually also believed in inerrancy of text. They also tended to be abstemious in their personal values, but they believed in this idea of the kingdom of God, and that you make the kingdom of God on earth by improving the lives of people in this world. And you do it by supporting organized labor. You do it by reaching out to Black Americans. You do it by the beginnings of interfaith work. And that is something Humphrey becomes steeped in as a teenager, and it guides a lot of his life. And the other, and this again, this just supports the point you made, the other really important element of Christianity for Humphrey is when you get the movement with groups like the National Conference of Christians and Jews, even though it's formed during the bigoted anti-Catholicism that's leveraged against Al Smith in 1928, it's really getting traction against the backdrop of the Holocaust and World War II. And Humphrey becomes part of a congregational church in Minneapolis. So he's no longer in the fundamentalist world of Protestantism now. The Congregationalists believe in human interpretation of text rather than divine dictation. And his minister, Philip Gregory, is very involved with the National Conference. And that's where Humphrey begins to make connections, as well as through people like Cecil Newman and Sam Shiner, with the Black community, with the Jewish community, with liberal Catholics, with liberal Protestants. And that's also tremendously important to him. And he always wrapped his civil rights language and his language of human rights in scripture. It was often missed by journalists because journalists, and this is partly self-condemnation, are so secular as a rule and so ill-equipped to deal with religion as a political force unless it's the shorthand of the religious right and it becomes synonymous with intolerance, that dealing with the religious left and religious liberalism is really difficult for journalists to do. And so even people who admired Humphrey and could talk about the idealism of him on these issues couldn't understand the religious foundations of a lot of that idealism. And I'm sorry, I don't want to go on too long because I want to let Elizabeth have her time. But yes, Minneapolis is a very seemingly unlikely place to be a hotbed of bigotry, but it was. And I think that part of decoding that is the demography. That one thing that when Carrie McWilliams, the great writer and activist, called Minneapolis the most anti-Semitic big city in America in an article in 1946, the headline of that article was "The Curious Twin." That's a reference to the Twin Cities. And the question he reckoned with, which I did too, is why is St. Paul so different? You literally cross the street in some parts of the Twin Cities or the river in others, and you go from Minneapolis to St. Paul. Well, the answer is that St. Paul had a Catholic plurality, and the Catholics, in order to have social and political power, needed to ally with other minority groups, specifically Blacks and Jews. And so in New York, they used to talk back in the day about the balanced ticket. You'd run an Irishman, an Italian, and a Jew for mayor, deputy mayor and comptroller of the city. And the balanced ticket, so to speak, in St. Paul was to have Catholic, Jewish, and Black interests represented politically. And it translated into things like in St. Paul, you had Jews as judges early in the 20th century. In St. Paul, Blacks could join labor unions. In Minneapolis, they couldn't, except the all-Black hotel workers union. And Minneapolis was an overwhelmingly Protestant city. It was Northern European, Scandinavian, British Isles. And having a huge demographic majority that also reflected the demographics of the whole region of Minnesota and much of the Great Plains left the Protestants in Minneapolis feeling like they didn't need to make any concession to minority groups. And Blacks and Jews collectively were maybe 3% of the entire Twin Cities. And even if you added the Catholics, and that's maybe 15% of Minneapolis. So there was this hegemony on the part of Northern European Protestants in Minneapolis that created a kind of a wraparound bigotry. There's a Black idiom that says in the South, the white man will let you get close, but not high. And in the North, they'll let you get high, but not close. But in Minneapolis, you couldn't get either. Blacks were confined to one neighborhood in North Minneapolis. There's an infamous episode I write about in the book when a Black World War I veteran postal office employee tries to buy a home in a mostly Scandinavian middle-class neighborhood in South Minneapolis. Night after night, 5,000 white people are besieging his home to drive him and his family out, which they succeed in doing a couple of years later. So they couldn't be close, but they also couldn't even be high, even though there was a veneer of Black publishers, lawyers, doctors, social workers. Overwhelmingly in Minneapolis, Blacks could only have two jobs. If you were male, you could work service in the hotel industry. If you were female, you could work service in domestic labor. That was it. And the anti-Semitism in Minneapolis was so thoroughgoing that in Minneapolis, Jews couldn't even belong to AAA. I actually read about and write about an episode in which Sam Shiner is trying to do testing, as they called it, in civil rights litigation. So he gets a rabbi to apply to AAA in Minneapolis, thinking they'll at least take a rabbi, or maybe they won't. And sure enough, AAA writes back to the rabbi and says, "Why don't you apply to AAA in St. Paul, which had a Jewish president?" So it went from everything like AAA to all the clubs, the hospitals, and so on. But even the University of Minnesota, and here I'm really beholden to the exceptional scholarship of Ravel and Prell and Kirsten Delegard, both of the University of Minnesota. And in Ravelin's fantastic web-based project at Campus Divided, she documents how the dean of students at the University of Minnesota kept a census of Black students, none of whom were allowed to live on campus. He kept a census of Jewish students, all of whom were presumed to be Bolsheviks. And that information was reported to a right-wing, Republican-oriented political sleuth named Ray Chase to be used to discredit these people. So this is, how expansive the bigotry in Minneapolis was at that time.
Thank you. To those in the audience, remember, you can get in the queue to ask a question through the Q&A function or the raise hand function. So you can do it now, you can do it later, just letting you know. Our second discussant this afternoon is Elizabeth Tandy Shermer, professor of history at Loyola University in Chicago. She is the author of Sunbelt Capitalism, Phoenix and the Transformation of American Politics, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2013, and Indentured Students, How Government Guaranteed Loans Left Generations Drowning in College Debt, published by Harvard University Press in 2021, and was the subject of a session of the Washington History Seminar. She's the editor or co-editor of 3 collections, and she's at work on a new project on the business of education, 2 centuries of competing for donations, research grants, state earmarks, and student fees. She's held research fellowships across the United States and around the world, including Cambridge University and the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, and she currently joins us from Canada, where she's spending the year as a Fulbright Fellow. Ellie, welcome back to the seminar.
Always good to be back, even if I don't get to be in my hometown of DC. So first and foremost, I want to thank everyone involved in putting this seminar together. It really is a treasure, and I'm actually glad it's remained on Zoom as we all go back. It's been great to be able to come Zoom in wherever I am. I'm always delighted to ask back to be comment on a new book. That's why I also have to thank Samuel Freedman for writing this incredibly engaging biography of a young Hubert Humphrey, who even in his older years was overlooked or perhaps overshadowed both by his contemporaries like Lyndon Baines Johnson and his proteges, including Clean Jean McCarthy and Walter Mondale. Now, Freedman has provided readers with a very focused biography of a man with a very long political career. And in doing so, he's provided a reminder that while the practice of biography is usually associated with weighty, lengthy tomes that take forever to write and weigh a ton, as in the case of Margaret Fuller, Robert Oppenheimer, Walter Reuther, and A. Philip Randolph, there's also real value in a focused look on just one part of a towering figure's life, as in the case of Leandro Zarno's look at Bella Abzug in the 60s and 70s, Christopher Phelps on a young Sidney Hook, and Dan Geary on Seawright Mills and the left in the 50s. But Freedman has also given readers an in-depth look at a young Humphrey, Pinky to his family, spent his formative years in South Dakota, the son of a man with big P populist connection. The elder Humphrey struggled to keep his small pharmacy open during the tumultuous teens, 20s, and 30s, turning to various get-rich schemes to hold on to the family's house. Unfortunately, he was not successful, really. Freedman stresses the importance of how white these rural communities were. It was Humphrey Jr.'s ambitions to get an education that first brought him to Minneapolis, which had a small Black and Jewish population, and then to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. In fact, Humphrey's introduction to the Jim Crow South was that train ride down when African Americans had to move to a separate car. And both those experiences and that education, Freedman argues, were crucial to a man torn between academia and politics. And he ultimately devoted himself to human rights, the phrase, as Jane noted, Humphrey used in the speech that inspired this book's title. Humphrey first did a lot for what scholars of the public now pretty universally call civil rights. As the mayor of Minneapolis, he successfully pushed for a mayor's council on human relations and a Fair Employment Practices Commission that drew the attention of National Democratic Party leaders, a party divided over its commitment to civil rights at the time, not just between staunch segregationists, but also more moderate members hesitant to take a public stance, let alone actually do something about it, or act now. As Freedman tells readers, Humphrey penciled into a speech after he helped shepherd the 1964 Civil Rights Act through Congress. And I will say that attention to detail, so well written, about the importance of really looking closely at those speeches in the edition, I thought was just such a great example of political history. But about 20 years before that celebratory speech, Humphrey made headlines, indeed came back to his adoptive home of Minneapolis as a hero for pushing the Democrats to include a civil rights plank in the 48 Democratic Party platform. And I will admit there was a part of me that wondered if the significance of that would be lost on contemporary readers, because how parties select their candidates has changed so much. The platforms don't get much attention anymore at all. Indeed, the Republicans didn't bother to update theirs between 2016 and 2020 until journalists noticed. But that plank mattered. Humphrey mattered. But the first question that I have for Freedman, and the one sitting above all my others, is how he sees this account of a young Humphrey changing how we, historians, journalists, and the interested public, should see these pivotal years, the 30s, but especially the 40s. And I ask that because I've had senior historians throughout my career, including those who have actually written those big biographies, tell me that history is not biography. Our profession even gives separate prizes for them. History as a discipline operates on the idea that human events do not begin or end with the birth and death of a single person. Historians and journalists often write really good biographies because they placed luminaries in their place and time to show how they shaped and were shaped by them. Often a single life or a larger than life person, or even an everyday person, as in the case of so-called microhistories, can illuminate more about a time and a place than a conventional community study. But there was a telling section that seemed to suggest this book was fundamentally maybe about a young Hubert Humphrey. From page 211, quote, "Again and again during the war years, Humphrey heard the call, not the call of God to faith, but the call of humanity to service. There were people from throughout his life who recognized something in him. Skills, yes, but something larger, a kind of destiny, more than he recognized it in himself. He was their vessel and their voice, the vessel in which to pour their passion for a more just America, and the voice to amplify that passion insistently enough to affect a nation whose soul was very much at stake." But that summation of Humphrey as a vessel doesn't actually fit what Freedman actually did in this book, as Jane mentioned in her comments. That work that Freedman does includes real depth and care to understanding rural white communities, both the connections to big P populism that Charles Costel argued didn't disappear, but found its way into the Democratic and Republican Party's liberal wings. But Freedman's telling of Humphrey's early life actually showed that. He did that work. But Freedman also provided rich portraits of the lives, experiences, and communities of Black and Jewish Americans, introducing readers to activists like Sam Shiner and Cecil Newman, who shaped how Humphrey understood the world and the actions that he took. So Into the Bright Sunshine also offers a rich portrait of US politics in an incredibly volatile but overlooked era. Indeed, Leo Rebuffo always maintained the 30s kind of seemed forgotten. Freedman shows us a major city with a left and a right, with liberals like Humphrey in the middle. And that was a refreshing portrait because historians of US politics focused a lot on the left in the work published in the 70s and 80s, before scholarly attention really focused on conservatism after the 1994 midterms. Now it seems really focused on the far right. As Julian Zelizer, who Freedman actually credits with inspiring this book, in the acknowledgements lamented, quote, liberals have been virtually written out of the story. But Freedman did not write them out. He did write, I'll admit, the best takedown of Jared L.K. Smith that I've seen in print. And Smith was a Huey Long acolyte that survived the Kingfish, so not a liberal. But it was just part of a much broader portrait of the political fault lines in Minneapolis, the Democratic Party, and the country as a whole. The kind of synthetic work that seems a much more helpful way forward for historians than focusing on one corner of US politics and understanding the American democratic experiment, especially as it continues to evolve. Indeed, Freedman's narrative really makes it clear that the fights at home before, during, and immediately after World War II were crucial to liberals' ability to try to complete the New Deal in the 60s, an era that has gotten a lot more scholarly attention in recent years, and perhaps, as I'll come back to, later shape the political divides after the Civil Rights Act's passage. As to what motivated Humphrey, I need to do this. Consider Humphrey's little sister, who finished college first and then worked in DC, one of the many young people taking the opportunity to be a part of New Deal efforts to reconstruct the country through the kind of public service that had been a part of progressive movements across the country since she and her brother, Hubert, were children. And I think it's interesting, too, that the most well-known progressive movements are coming from the Midwest. So it does feel like this very Midwestern story. So maybe that's a way to understand Humphrey's call to service. He was a person of his time. But why would Humphrey be able to win in 45? This is the mayorship. So recent historical work has really focused on that moment as important for conservative and far-right movements. After all, Republicans retook Congress in 46, and Operation Dixie, labor campaign in the South, dramatically ended. But in Freedman's telling, Humphrey's winning 45 coalition makes sense. After African Americans publicly fought for a double V, victories over fascism abroad and racism at home, they were a part of what the Roosevelt administration declared to be an all-American war effort that put Jews, Catholics, and Protestants together in the same trenches. Obviously, Blacks were not. But white, Black, and brown war production workers also labored in the same factories, whether rapidly shifted to defense needs in the Steel Belt or healthily built across the South and West. There's a part of me that wonders if Humphrey had an easier time winning in a city with such a small African-American population. But urban politics was changing nationwide, so maybe I'm wrong to be skeptical. In the Northeast and Midwest, trade union candidates won seats in places like Yonkers and Philly. Across the South and West, there were also battles over reforming city and state governments. They generally ended with young, white, conservative businessmen dethroning an older, entrenched agricultural elite. But working people, white, Black, and brown, put up one hell of a fight across the South and West. And nationwide, Americans also protested the inequities built into the GI Bill that didn't challenge the quota system, something as awful, well, maybe not as awful as what was happening at the University of Minnesota, or Jim Crow segregation. And those were both keeping colleges separate and unequal, something anathema to the double V that ordinary Americans mentioned in their outrage of how Jewish, Catholic, and Black veterans were being kept from the college educations promised in the GI Bill's Title II, including at University of Minnesota. However, how to define this moment's liberal center, its fault lines, and Humphrey's place in it was still unclear. And some clarity on that question, how to define moderates in the 30s and 40s, could be helpful to this book's potential contribution to understanding. And I realized from Freedman's opening comments, he's thinking about it as a parable for our time, but I also think this book has a lot to say about the current divides within the Democratic Party as well. While reading, I kept coming back to Martin Luther King's famous line from his 63 letter to Christian and Jewish religious leaders, written from a Birmingham jail. Quote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate." Now, in that moment, he's talking about white moderates in the South, but I think the question of the white moderate nationwide could be helpful here. So not the stumbling block of an ardent segregationist like Strom Thurmond, but maybe a Missourian Harry Truman sitting on executive orders to desegregate the military, something within his power as commander-in-chief to do, as opposed to the harder work of getting meaningful civil rights and voting rights legislation through Congress and actually enforcing it as the Johnson administration with Humphrey as vice president did in the 60s. So was Humphrey ally or stumbling block? He visited DC before moving to Baton Rouge, but didn't see the Jim Crow segregation that defined the nation's capital then, something that puzzled Freedman, rightly so. In his first failed 1942 mayoral bid, Humphrey made allusions of being Nordic Protestant descent amongst attacks that he was tied to Jewish mobs. Waffling as well on Minneapolis's FEPC on what kind, if any, consequences there would be on businesses that discriminated. In fairness, they're in there in the final bill. And it was true that Humphrey, once elected to the Senate in 48, hired the first Black senatorial staffer and took him to lunch in the senator's dining room. It might be a bit of a stretch to say that act alone desegregated that dining room, but it was an important moment for sure. Humphrey's bills for a civil rights commission and anti-lynching were also dead on arrival, not surprisingly. But were those bills introduced seriously or performatively, especially since Humphrey had received so much adulation nationwide after the 48 convention? One way to suss that question out, what committees did Humphrey want to and first serve on when he got to Congress? Was he strategizing for the future, like a young Barry Goldwater who arrived in the Senate just 4 years later, eager to serve on the Labor and Public Welfare Committee to continue assaulting organized labor, a key part of his early political career and the business conservatives agenda that we can still feel the effects of as the UAW remains on strike and no Starbucks union has finalized a contract? I think anti-communism has to be considered when assessing the ally or stumbling block question. There were many different varieties of anti-communism in this era. Humphrey was a liberal one, yes, a member of the Americans for Democratic Action, better known as the ADA, who united Minneapolis's farm and Democratic parties, but he also turned on Henry Wallace. Historians still debate how much anti-communism thwarted the civil rights and labor movements. Freedman was correct. There were a lot of unions that remained segregated in this era, absolutely. But some of the most militant union organizers were or had been communists committed to racial equality, although Richard White's famous essay, "And the God That Failed," showed the limits of that. Communists would be expelled from the labor movement after the Taft-Hartley Act's passage, which had consequences for labor and civil rights movements. And I'll mention, since this book does go a little bit into Humphrey's early Senate career, Pinckney actually supported the Kilgore Amendment during his first term in office that would have interned subversives without a trial, the model being Japanese internment. And I want to move to questions about Humphrey and labor rights because they are central, like anti-communism, to parsing what kind of white moderate Humphrey was. So a way to see, yes, there was a left, right, and central, and liberal center, but the intersecting fault lines running through them were about anti-communism, labor rights, and civil rights. And a generation of historians, 2 generations ago actually, show that if you want to find civil rights activism before Brown, you got to look to the labor movement in the 30s and the 1940s. So this book does treat civil rights as an issue unto itself, a definition possibly at odds with Humphrey's choice of words, walking into the bright sunshine of human rights. But readers don't learn much about Humphrey's stance on labor rights. Jane thankfully brought up the UN General Assembly before I was going to, but it had been working on its Declaration of Human Rights that same summer. It wouldn't be formally adopted until December 48, about a month after Truman's victory, and labor rights were among those listed. And that's reflective of a moment in time in the US when labor and civil rights were more clearly intertwined, perhaps best embodied by A. Philip Randolph, who makes several cameo appearances in this book. And one way to understand Randolph's demands for a permanent federal FEPC, that's what he wanted from Democrats, and full Black participation in the military, meaning desegregation, was that paid work, whether as a civilian or soldier, came with important employment benefits, like Social Security for civilians, or the potential for rewards for military service, given that moment's rollout of the first GI Bill. A job meant access to basic citizenship rights, what the UN was labeling human rights. But what was Humphrey's stance on labor rights? How can we help that understand what kind of moderate he was? Workplace rights were not the same as the full employment legislation debated at the time and the bill that bared his name in the 60s. Freedman mentioned that Humphrey courted organized labor and his winning coalition for the mayorship included organized labor. In the late 40s, that really means he won over white men working in manufacturing. A lot of them cared about another important part of the 1948 Democratic Party platform. One Southern segregationist hated labor rights. The first 5 paragraphs dedicated to domestic policy in that platform were about labor rights, including 2 on the repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act passed in 47. That law had passed after Congress overruled a veto from Truman, who most scholars agree, I still think so, did it to appease labor, not for any allegiance to democratic unionism. On the ballot in 48 across the country were right-to-work referenda, which in the South, Thurman biographer Joe Crispino showed to be an example of massive resistances, plural, to labor and civil rights. A person's stance on labor rights has always been a canary in the coal mine. And historian Jim Cobb indeed quoted trade unionists who point out that Thurman by the 70s would shake hands and even hug Black voters, but he wouldn't go near a union organizer. And labor rights were also a key part of Midwestern politics in these pivotal years. Taft was, after all, from Ohio. Freedman noted these conflicts to explain the political cauldron Humphrey moved into, far different from the small Dakota towns dominated by preachers as well as farmers and shopkeepers. Freedman mentioned that the 35 Wagner Act didn't cover agriculture, and domestic workers, but not the third set of employees denied these basic workplace rights, public employees, the men and women reporting to a young Mayor Humphrey. And historian Will Jones has showed that the same racism and xenophobia drove public employees' omission, but not just from Southern segregationists, but also representatives from urban areas as well. There were still municipal unions across the country, likely two in Minneapolis. I just don't know the city well enough. I'd be surprised if the police force Hubert Humphrey was trying to clean up wasn't unionized. So how did Humphrey treat public employee unions? View their rights even though they weren't protected by federal law? What did Humphrey think about their exclusion from key parts of the New Deal? What was his attitude about the Labor Peace Acts first passed in the Midwest before they came before Congress as the Taft-Hartley Act? What did Humphrey have to say, if anything, about the 48 Democratic Platform's statement on labor rights? And if Humphrey had nothing to say about it, it's pretty telling too. One reason, the famous memo from Clark Clifford that Freedman mentioned as crucial to Truman's reelection strategy actually named both civil rights and labor rights as the keys to winning in 1948. And I think those questions matter to how we might understand both Humphrey and this moment in time's larger importance. One of the things organized labor wanted from Johnson in '64 was the repeal of 14B, one of the most odious parts of the Taft-Hartley Act. It permits states to pass right-to-work laws. Now, historians for years have looked at Johnson's lip service to that promise as a prime example of wanting working-class votes, but not doing a darn thing for working people once in office, a way to understand how Democrats were complicit in U.S. labor law now favoring employers instead of employees, like the UAW and Starbucks workers still wanting a contract. Only because Freedman mentioned Humphrey's role in the '64 Civil Rights Act am I going to ask this. Did Humphrey try to shepherd such a repeal through Congress of 14B? Or was his focus on the Civil Rights Act alone? He was rightly proud of it and the Voting Rights Act when he spoke before the National Urban League meeting, penciling in Act Now, one of the moments in the book, that moments in time the book ends with. But the members were likely members with Black middle and professional classes, just like Humphrey's Jewish and Black intimates, Shiner and Newman, also came from a more moneyed step. And who Humphrey was speaking to matters because there's a different read on what the Civil Rights Act meant for working people, regardless of their race. Historians like Nelson Lichtenstein and Will Schiller highlight the Civil Rights Act as really driving a wedge between labor rights on the job, the collective rights for workers, and a promise to protect an individual against discrimination, something businesses thought before it became clear it'd be a heck of a lot cheaper to settle one wrongful termination suit than raise wages by $1. So did Humphrey have a more capacious view of civil rights? Did he care at all about the rights of public employees on the job? In his lifetime, more likely to be people of color. They got some protection from JFK's executive order and various state protections, but the public employee questions matters before then, when Humphrey was mayor, and they still mattered in the mid-60s. King considered labor rights important to civil rights. He was in Memphis when he was murdered because he was there supporting Black sanitation workers who marched with signs declaring, "I am a man." Civil rights were in our labor rights and were in our human rights. And those questions about a young Humphrey's commitment to labor rights entwined with civil rights, as well as the civil liberties that anti-communism endangered, speak to my first question. How does a reevaluation of young Humphrey change our understanding of these pivotal years, the 30s and 40s? From Freedman's opening comments, I can definitely see that what he's portrayed here was a cauldron of our own time, left, right, and center. But there's an effort right now among historians to trace today's democratic socialists back to young Democrats in the 70s, concerned about working people. And their focus on the 70s actually might be at odds with the story Freedman tells, going beyond Humphrey as a vessel. But it isn't clear. Does Humphrey's early career illuminate how moderates of that era shaped the divides that plague the Democratic Party today? Could we understand Humphrey as a forebearer of the so-called Atari or New Deal Democrats, attuned more to the wealthy? Or was he actually a precursor to today's democratic socialists who have once again articulated that jobs for everyone, specifically noting longstanding systemic racial and gender and class inequalities need to be good and workplaces democratic? And I think there's so much in this book to help us understand our own divisive time, which is just one of the many reasons Freedman's biography is such a compelling read. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. Sam?
Well, thank you so much, Ellie. That's a really trenchant and wonderful response to the book. I'll just say, first of all, there's probably a whole book that someone should write about Humphrey and labor issues and labor rights, and it's just simply not the book I chose to write. And I have no reason from the work I did do to doubt his support for labor rights all along. He came into political life as a diehard New Dealer. And, by dint of the Wagner Act and other New Deal efforts, that was a period of a great upsurge in unionization. So he certainly was supportive of that as a young New Dealer. When he gets to Minneapolis, if you're going to be part of liberal or even centrist politics in Minneapolis, and he's definitely liberal rather than centrist, that's already existing as pro-union work. The Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota, which only merges with the Democratic Party in the mid-40s, farmer labor, as you note, began as this attempt to reconcile what had been the frictions between small farmers and urban workers attempting to unionize by putting them in one party together. And it's part of what gives Minnesota its kind of sui generis state political culture. But simply by dint of it being the Farmer Labor Party, it was completely on board with union rights, with union activism. And even when it merges with the Democratic Party, which in Minnesota was a little bit more of a traditional big city machine, trading material goods and jobs for loyalty, that was sort of the way the Democratic Party went about its business in a city like St. Paul. And being the more Catholic city it was, it also had kind of ethnic and religious affinities there. That also was pro-union, maybe not on public employees, and I truly don't know what Humphrey's stance was on public employees, but in terms of unions representing workers in private employment, there's no question that it was favorable. So to me, that was a bit of a no-brainer that Humphrey was pro-labor. In fact, when he runs for mayor the first time in 1943, he's brought into that campaign by organized labor in Minneapolis. And the flaw, though, in many unions at that time, with the, I think, idealistic exemption, as you say, of communist union organizers going back into the 30s, just like communists with Scottsboro's Boys case were the only large block of organized white people in the 30s to really support civil rights. And just as an aside, Cecil Newman, Humphrey's great friend and influence, is writing editorials in the 1930s that blacks should not vote for Franklin Roosevelt. They should vote for the Communist Party because the communists are the only, again, organized white political entity or even integrated political entity to really champion black equality. Anyway, my concern was more the hypocrisy of labor unions in a city like Minneapolis. In Minneapolis, if you know anything about the city's history, the origin story almost raised to mythological importance of the left in Minneapolis is the Teamsters strike in 1934, which was part of a great wave of union activism at that time, and in which, to their everlasting credit, the unions go out on strike, resist the hiring of management thugs, resist the complicity of the police force in order to win a strike that finally breaks the power in the private job labor market in Minneapolis of a group called the Citizens Alliance, which was this very right-wing business owners association and industry owners association of that time. Yet when they celebrate their victory, the Teamsters Union goes to a hotel where they're served by the segregated Black Hotel Workers Union. And in spite of the efforts of Black union members in Minneapolis, like Anthony Brutus Cassius and Nellie Stone, later better known as Nellie Stone Johnson, they're allies of the unions, but the unions aren't their allies. The unions in Minneapolis persist in being opposed to Black membership. In St. Paul, Blacks could belong to the stockyards unions, for instance. In Minneapolis, Blacks couldn't belong to any unions except their own. Cecil Newman tried to actually, for the better part of a year, organized a boycott, a consumer boycott of breweries in Minneapolis, because the management wouldn't hire Black workers and the brewery unions wouldn't have Black rank and file members. And I think that built-in hypocrisy really interested me. And that was something that Humphrey attempted to address. And this was not just a Minneapolis issue. It was a national problem with organized labor. And it continued to be, if you go into the 70s with the battles over discrimination by particularly building trades unions, the craft unions. But you are totally right that the industrial unions, the CIO unions, are really champions of civil rights. And Humphrey works very closely through the ADA and through this fascinating group called Fair Play in Bowling, which at the same time, Jackie Robinson is desegregating Major League Baseball. Bowling is one of the most popular post-war sports. And Walter Reuther and the UAW and A. Philip Randolph and Walter White really took on, along with Humphrey, the segregation that the American Bowling Congress practiced in its tournaments. So I think in the ADA and in Fair Play for Bowling, and of course a lot moving forward, Humphrey is working hand in glove with people like Walter Reuther and William Green in the CIO. So I think, again, there's no reason to doubt his commitment to union rights throughout. I think he also sees very clearly that civil rights legislation alone won't do everything. In the speech you very kindly mentioned from the epilogue of the book that he gives to an Urban League convention in Miami Beach on the night before the House of Representatives is going to vote on the Voting Rights Act, he very presciently says that the advances that are being made on civil rights, on public accommodations, on voting rights will solve part of the problem of racism in this country, but they're not going to be able to by themselves address income inequality. He foresees the bifurcation that's coming in the Black community, in which a middle class and upper middle class part of the Black community will really benefit from voting rights, from public accommodations, from affirmative action, but a part of the urbanized and also in the South rural, poor, less educated Black population risks being left behind. And he knows that without employment programs, you can't address that. And the last great effort, poignantly, of his political life is his effort to put through a full employment bill, the Humphrey-Hawkins bill in the 1970s, which is watered down to an inch of its life, partly to placate Jimmy Carter, who, even though he was a great liberal in his post-presidency, as is rightly remarked upon, is in some ways the beginning of neoliberalism in the Democratic Party with his moves for deregulation. And he's very concerned about backing legislation that would have any teeth in it, asking for full employment. So Humphrey was still seeing that clearly at the end. To your other points, he's a cold warrior, no question about it. His backing of McCarran Walter was loathsome, but it's of a piece with his support for Vietnam. And both of those things follow on his role in the intra-left liberal battles in Minnesota, in the DFL party, of whether it would be dominated by CP activists and Popular Front allies and fellow travelers, or by anti-communist liberals who were ruthless in purging their former allies from the party. Humphrey was a little bit paradoxical. He's defended the aforementioned Nellie Stone Johnson from being purged from the DFL, even though it was well known she'd never made any effort to hide it, that she'd been a member of the Young Communist League early in her career, but in that very Humphrey way, because he felt personally close to Nellie Stone Johnson. He wouldn't let her get purged, but he was perfectly willing to let Orv Freeman be his enforcer, to be his hatchet man and lead in the purging, and Humphrey went along with it. And in the ugly DFL battles at that time, Humphrey was being called a fascist also, which was hardly a defensible portrayal of him. But he always had that that Cold Warrior element to him. And that's why, although you didn't ask this, that's why I don't really credit this view of Humphrey on Vietnam as he was basically against the war and it was purely out of loyalty to LBJ that he went along. I think, like LBJ, as we know from the White House tapes, Humphrey could hold two thoughts at the same time. This is a catastrophe. We have tapes of Johnson saying that to Richard Russell in 64, 65. And Humphrey's espousing some of those thoughts to Johnson, who doesn't want to hear them, in 65. And yet at the same time, a baseline Cold Warrior sensibility in Humphrey makes it too easy for him to reconcile then supporting the war. Yes, it's expedient to get back on LBJ's good side, but Humphrey also has had those feelings all along. And I found a very, very important oral history that was done with George McGovern, in which McGovern talks about reconciling with Humphrey late in Humphrey's life. So this is probably the mid to late 1970s. Somewhere between 73 and 77 would be my guess. Well, from memory, it's cited in my book. But in any case, and McGovern talks about how they lived in the same DC suburb and they'd go for walks together in the morning. And one day, unprompted, Humphrey says to him, George, people say that I only supported the Vietnam War because of Lyndon, but that wasn't true. I believed in it. I know now that was the wrong decision, but I don't want you to think I would have taken a stand like that just because Lyndon told me to. And Humphrey gave interviews at the end of his life in which he said as much. He really was contrite and didn't try to excuse it and said, this was my greatest mistake. And he did own it, but it's a consistent mistake with other stances he took with some of Humphrey at his worst. I'm glad you want to draw more attention to the 40s. So do I. And you ask another great question, which is how could he win in a city with Minneapolis's history of bigotry in 1945 as mayor? I think it's a unique moment in time. And in a couple of ways that telescope out from Minneapolis, but are certainly felt there. He's running for mayor in May and June, first the primary, then the general election in 1945. This is just as VE Day has happened. It's just as Dwight Eisenhower has brought American journalists into the Nazi concentration camps to get footage for newsreels because he's afraid otherwise the public will not believe the extermination machinery that has happened. The first articles by American journalists in English about the final solution are being published. The Red Army had brought in Russian journalists to Treblinka in 1944 to write similar articles and take similar photos. And because it came from the Red Army, it wasn't believed in this country, or wasn't widely enough believed. But finally, it's now being believed by a substantial number of Americans. That's part of the ambient radiation. There's also an ambient radiation of an amazing period in journalism and pop culture. From 1943 to 1948, I actually wrote an essay about this for The Atlantic some months ago. This is a period when An American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal comes out. This is a period when a now forgotten but best-selling writer in his time, an Armenian-American, a refugee from the Armenian genocide named Avidas Darunian, pen name John Roy Carlson, wrote two books in the mid-1940s. First, Undercover, then The Plotters. The first one is about the pro-Nazi movement in America. The second one is about the right-wing extremism of people like Gerald L.K. Smith, and both of them were based on de Roonian going undercover and going to these meetings. That's why he took on this WASP name to hide that he was actually Armenian. And his books are bestsellers. They catch something in the culture at this time. Frank Sinatra's song and short film, The House I Live In, come out at this time. The song, The House I Live In, the lyrics are written by Abel Meeropol, pen name Lewis Allen, the same lyricist of Strange Fruit, the anti-lynching anthem that Billie Holiday made famous. And in that song and in that film, the film is about a Jewish kid being chased by a Protestant gang, and Frank Sinatra, leaving a recording studio to take a smoking break in the alley, interrupts this beating that's going to happen. And he tells the kids, and the language is fierce. He says, "You're doing what Nazis would do." And it goes on in that vein. And in the song, one of the lyrics that Abel Meeropol wrote that Sinatra sings says, "All races and religions, that's America to me." That's a radical restructuring of what it means to be an American. That to be an American is not to be a white Protestant or to pretend to be one or to submit to a secondary way of life to be one. This is what we would now call cultural pluralism or the gorgeous mosaic. And, and it's followed by, this is a little later than Humphrey's running for mayor, but the book and the film Gentleman's Agreement. So there's a body of mass culture in fiction and nonfiction that's out there. And I think in Minneapolis, when you add to that the return of massive numbers of GIs to their families, the movement of GIs who maybe weren't from Minneapolis, but are enrolling on the GI Bill at the University of Minnesota and living with their wives and little kids in the Quonset huts. And a lot of them come back, even if they're not Black, with that double V idea of what did we just spill all this blood for? Who were we fighting against? And what are we going to do about what's on the home front? And what raises this to a sharp point right when Humphrey's running for mayor is, as I said before, at this time when everyone has reason to know what the final solution meant, there's a series of beatings of Jewish kids and teenagers in Minneapolis. They're being robbed at knife point and gunpoint. Their cars are being run off the road. They're being pushed through plate glass windows. They're being made to submit to Heil Hitler salutes. And when this is happening in April 45, the Jewish community holds a mass meeting at the junior high in their North Minneapolis ghetto. And one of the rabbis who speaks there says, what have our sons been dying for if this is what's going on the home front? And the mayor of Minneapolis and his police chief give the answer that establishment Minneapolis, and this is where you're so on point, the cowardice and the perfidy of the good people in the middle, right? The same kind of people Dr. King wrote a letter to from Birmingham jail for. They do what they've always done. They say, this is just teenage hooligans. And before that, when the Silver Shirts were having meetings in Minneapolis, this is just the great unwashed. Except it wasn't. It was mainstream accepted and sometimes mainstream embraced. And when Humphrey responds to it, he says, Minneapolis has been warned about its anti-Semitism for decades. And it had been in articles, in books by activists like Sam Shiner and Cecil Newman. And they wanted to poo-poo it. And Humphrey says it was inevitable, it would become violent, and now it has. And he immediately released this as part of his campaign, this plan for taking on civil rights, human relations. And I think he caught a moment when people could hear that, when people wanted to hear that, when it was a political message, it conformed with what was in the news, it conformed what was in the pop culture. And also, just plain, Humphrey was a great campaigner. And the guy he ran against, Marvin Klein, not Jewish, although the name is Germanic, Marvin Klein was a complacent two-term incumbent who thought this loudmouth kid couldn't beat him. And Humphrey, also just plain out-campaigned Marvin Klein. So all those things add together. And, when you're talking about the dawn of the Cold War, such an important point, not only does it do a lot of damage to the left liberal, organized labor alliance on civil rights, but also it puts an end to this pop culture I'm talking about. it's replaced by Red Scare pop culture. This golden moment of teachable moments in pop culture, 43 to 48, ends. And then it becomes all the anti-communist movies and literature. And there was a book that came out in 1948, right as this was ending, called In the Land of Jim Crow, written by a reporter on the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Ray Spriggle. I think it's Spirgle. What he does is he tried to dye his skin to be black, but he found out the chemicals were toxic. So he actually just shaves his straight hair, goes to Florida for 3 weeks and stays in the sun, and with one drop rule, presents himself in the South as black and is able to be accepted as black, and writes this multi-part series for the Pittsburgh newspaper about what he experienced. And it's syndicated in the Pittsburgh Courier, the great black newspaper, the New York Herald Tribune. But when the book version comes out, it doesn't sell many copies. The worm has turned. People want to read Red Scare stuff at that point. He was 12 or 13 years ahead of John Roy Griffith, who wrote Black Like Me. Black Like Me wasn't a breakthrough. He just did the same thing Spriggle had done, but it hadn't gotten noticed because it was right at the moment the pop culture turned. And you're so on point about that. And there's probably a great microhistory to be done just about that period when the curtain rang down on a certain kind of liberal activism and the Cold War begins to dominate the conversation.
Thank you. We've got a couple of hands up. First, we have Glenna Matthews, and then if Leon Fink would be on standby, we'll get to you in a moment. So Glenna, if you would unmute, join the conversation.
I believe I'm unmuted. Is that right?
Yes, you have.
I want to make a comment. I want to tell Sam, if I may, in 1948, I was a 9-year-old white girl in Visalia, California, in the Central Valley. And I was a nerd, and I listened to the entire Democratic Convention. And that speech was electrifying. I have never forgotten it. I was thrilled to see that you've written a book about this when I began to read the reviews. And I think the speech absolutely helped push me to become a professional historian of the U.S. and shaped a lot of my research interests. So I just wanted you to know that speech resonated with this particular person.
Thank you so much. Well, there are a lot of nerds. 70 million people listened or watched that speech. It was more popular than Super Bowl is today. And the mail Humphrey got, the telegrams, the letters, which were equally divided between praise and hate, showed the outpouring from having so many people listen or watch it.
It's interesting. We've had in the Q&A, someone reporting that their parents told them about the 1948 convention and was impressed. And then someone else also mentions their parents in 1968, parents who happened to have been in the Communist Party back in the 40s, saying that they had always appreciated that speech as well. Leon Fink, unmute, please.
Okay, yes. Professor Freedman, I wanted to ask you about the denouement of Hubert Humphrey's career and the period after you address it in your book, but I think it would still be relevant. That is his position on foreign policy issues and how his early idealism carried over or did not carry over. We tend to see 1948 as the great Hubert Humphrey, and then 20 years later as the diminished Hubert Humphrey. And you also used, it's easy to pigeonhole that decline and just clothe it in the Cold War or Cold Warism. But obviously, the Cold War covers a lot of positions. And in terms of Hubert Humphrey's the early period that you cover in the book, there were surely important international issues then too, whether it was decolonization, whether it was the U.S. relation to Israel, whether it was questions of third world development and foreign aid, the poverty in places like India, whether the U.S. Good neighbor policy in Central and Latin America would be sustained or interrupted. Those are all key foreign policy questions. How do you see Humphrey developing, prior to the tragedy that he regretted about his Vietnam position? But was there an evolution or devolution in his approach to liberal foreign policy? What did liberal internationalism really mean to him, other than anti-communism?
I think he was a liberal internationalist, and it was partly, expedient because he understood the war of hearts and minds against the model of Marxist-Leninism. He even addresses that in the speech at the 48 convention. But it also, I think, was part of his view that it was a wide world and one needed to engage with it. And I think this goes back to his decision to be pro-intervention in World War II, as early as 1939 and 1940, when isolationism was rampant. The most transformative formal educator of his life during this amazing year he studied at Louisiana State University was an exiled, part Jewish, anti-Nazi professor named Rudolf Eberle, who taught Humphrey about the rise of the Nazis in Europe, taught Humphrey about the complacency of moderates and the co-option of establishment conservatives. And also, Eberle was arguing when it was hard to do it, especially if you're a German part Jew who just got to America to a safe sanctuary, in favor of intervention. And Humphrey misapplied that interventionist instinct in Vietnam, but it served him well in other areas. He was really one of the ideal leaders behind what became the Peace Corps. Kennedy and Sergeant Shriver and others tend to get the credit for it, but Humphrey really was one of the early exponents of that idea. As much of a Cold Warrior as he was an advocate for disarmament talks and treaties between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. He was a very early supporter of Zionism, of the state of Israel, I think because of his experience as mayor of encountering Holocaust survivors trying to move to Minneapolis, trying to find their relatives here. I won't even begin to venture what he would think of Israel as it became later, but and I think in terms of the developing world and decolonization, it's not an area I've read deeply in, but I certainly don't see him as anyone who defended empire. And in fact, when he made trips as vice president to Africa, he brought Cecil Newman along on those trips. And part of Humphrey's legacy is a program called the Humphrey Fellows, which is aimed at being international young scholars, public officials, thought leaders to this country to study with and have engagement with American universities. So that was absolutely a part of him. And it coexisted with the catastrophic decision of Vietnam that he made on Vietnam. It coexisted with his reprehensible vote on McCarran Walter. And just like his effort to pass a full employment law at the end of his life coexisted with those mistakes. So Humphrey made grievous errors, but we're not talking about someone who, in the original meaning of the term, was a neoconservative. We're not talking about someone who was a New Dealer and then became not just an anti-communist, but an anti-liberal. This isn't Irving Kristol, or Midge Decter or Jeane Kirkpatrick. He maintained most of the aspects of his liberalism. Eric, on mute.
I've done 100 of these plus. John Martin, if you can pose a very quick question, and Sam, a very quick answer. We're almost out of time, but unmute John.
Sam, this sounds like a wonderful book. I'm really looking forward to it. It seems to illuminate a part of my own career in the early 50s when I was starting as a journalist. And I would go out on stories, and there would be parts of, like, one story was about a Belgian worker priest and what good he was doing for help. And I remember writing a story, handing it in, going home, waking up the next morning, and was completely changed by the editors into an story involving, quote, those communists and so forth. Is there a section of this book that gets into that, or is it just in passing?
No, the book really is primarily ending in 1948. There's a prologue when he gives a speech in Philadelphia in the same hall where he gave the civil rights speech in 48, and he's dying and he's largely disparaged. And then there's an epilogue that goes in a few scenes from the 48 campaign up to the Unite the Right rally and George Floyd's murder, and the way that actually affect the daughter of Sam Shiner and the granddaughter of Cecil Newman. But, good 95% of the book is between 1922 and 1948.
Thank you. I unfortunately have to draw this to a close, and I have a long list of questions that I wanted to pose that I won't be able to get to, I'm afraid. But I want to say thank you to Sam, to Jane, and to Ellie, and to those of you in the audience. And for those watching, please join us again on Monday, October 16th at 4 p.m. When we return for a seminar session on Brooke Blauer's Americans in a World at War, Intimate Histories from the Crash of the Pan Am's Yankee Clipper, with commentators Eric Rauschway and Mary Dudziak. Thank you all very much. Take care. Be safe.